Sophie Gilbert's Girl on Girl, published in the year 2024, is one of the sharpest diagnoses of contemporary Western femininity. Her main argument is that the adult entertainment industry has escaped our browsers and slowly crept into mainstream culture. It's visible in the way celebrities and starlets dress, the way they perform and present themselves. And this has happened so gradually that a lot of people hardly notice, and we as the audience have become desensitized to how normal the adult aesthetic has become. The charged music video being very explicit, provocative, the cover images, and the raunchy live performances are so popular PR strategies that increased interest in female entertainers. But there's been a larger chain of corporate beneficiaries behind those women. It's the managers, the producers, the photographers, who are often male and push the stars and starlets beyond what they felt comfortable with. Think of the provocative American apparel campaigns or Britney Spears on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine wearing underwear looking seductively at only 17 years old. Or Girls Gone Wild videos that were the backdrop of an era that pushed the perception of what modern young women should look like. Gilbert's assessment correctly follows the cultural lineage that has paved the way for teenagers flocking to the platform that starts with O and ends with fans. While Gilbert mostly focuses on the Anglosphere, I want to look at the impact of the adult entertainment industry on European cultures, specifically Eastern and Balkan cultures. But before I go there, I want to touch upon the Western European fascination with adult entertainment aesthetic and the stars and starlets that emerged out of that sector. Ariel Levy has described in her book Female Chauvinist Pig how slowly the adult entertainment aesthetic has an impact on popular culture. You see pole dancing as a fitness trend. You saw the Playboy branding that appeared on accessories directly targeted at teenagers, and the new sexiness was repackaged as a form of female empowerment, even though it was a marketing strategy. The mechanism was corporate, and the beneficiaries were sort of diffuse. It was media conglomerates, advertising agencies, platform companies. And interestingly, it was wrapped in the language of individual choice and feminism. Women were told that they were choosing this, being empowered, and that it was strong and feminine to perform sexually on your own terms. In the Anglosphere, this particular aesthetic is layered. It arrives wearing a certain irony or branding. It comes in the language of female empowerment. Western Europe had its fair share of celebrities who used adult content aesthetic as a springboard. But it was a lot wackier. Since the 1970s, Europe's morals had become looser than the US American. The adult industry was flourishing, and actresses and performers were increasingly trying to cross over to the mainstream media. Lola Ferrari, born Yves Valois in France in 1963, became famous in the 1990s as an adult performer who underwent dozens of surgical procedures to achieve an extreme and almost cartoonish version of femininity. In fact, she broke records with her breast augmentations. She was a mainstream celebrity in France and well known outside of her home country, and she was appearing on television, releasing music. But Ferrari was a tragic figure overall. Her childhood was miserable, with her father being absent most of the time, and the relationship with her mother was strained. Entering the adult industry and even selling her own body seemed to be the only path towards fame and fortune. She passed away in the year 2000, aged only 37, in circumstances her family considers suspicious. Her husband was investigated. A less depressing example is Cicciolina, born Ilona Staller in the socialist Hungarian People's Republic. She emigrated to Italy, became an adult entertainment star, and was even elected to the Italian parliament in 1987 as a member of the Radical Party. During her campaign, she often slashed her breast and caused quite an outrage. She later married US American artist Jeff Koons, who made her the subject of a celebrated yet pretty controversial series of explicit artworks called Made in Heaven. They're basically depictions of very explicit actions, but sort of in a classy shape of glass or marble statuettes. They divorced in the 90s as she didn't want to stop making adult content after their son was born. Ferrari and Stella are extraordinary figures. The public was fascinated by such bold women because they arrived at a moment in Europe of cultural optimism and a public that was already aware of the adult industry. Of course, there was the emerging media landscape that loved gossip, rewarded scandals, and moral mishaps. The conservative masses in Europe enjoyed criticizing those explicit and provocative women and tolerated their presence just enough to push constant public scrutiny over them. What stands out is that those two examples are creating their paths as an individual result of their circumstances in free societies with functioning institutions. This is pretty important because what I'm going to describe next is something categorically different. It's not the individual circumstances, but a mass and structural phenomenon where women use a certain image. This distinction matters. To understand what happened in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, I would like to borrow a concept from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. He had this understanding of how different types of capital can be converted one to another. Bourdieu argued that societies are basically like fields, which are structured spaces where different forms of capital compete for legitimacy. The economic capital is the most tangible form. It includes things like money, assets, property. Cultural capital exists in three states. There's the embodied, that includes accent, taste, or your habits. Then there's the objectified, which includes things like books, so items that can be purchased to display a certain class. And thirdly, there's the institutionalized capital, like credentials, diplomas. Then there's social capital, which holds the value of networks and your relationships. It's not just who you know, but the obligations and the access that you gain from the membership in certain groups. Symbolic capital is basically the master category above all of them. It includes prestige, honor, and recognition. What's interesting is that this is what is left when all the other forms of capital are forgotten. And when you basically have accumulated so much advantage that it is sort of perceived as a natural authority. It is often the product of money and access to certain networks, but people don't really think about it. A doctor commands authority not only because his knowledge, but because the specific type of title that he holds carries accumulated institutional recognition across generations. In a functioning society, women can convert multiple forms of capital into status and security. For instance, getting a degree, learning a trade will translate mostly into a career. A career can translate into financial independence, and your professional network can translate into social standing. The body is one currency among many, and not necessarily the most important one, all things considered. British sociologist Catherine Hakim has introduced the concept of sexual capital as an additional form. While Hakim has been pretty much criticized for reducing relationships to mere transactions, her addition can be helpful to understand what has happened in the 90s and the 2000s, when women were left without any means in Eastern Europe. This is precisely what I want to talk about. The fact that women didn't have any forms of capital is what happened after the implosion of the socialist system. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Degrees led nowhere because the very institutions that would recognize the degrees had themselves been either hollowed out or corrupted. Large parts of the labor market had dissolved, and the rule of law had failed its citizens. In this particular climate, which form of capital do you believe retained its value? In post-communist Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia in the 1990s and early 2000s, the answer was increasingly social capital in the form of proximity to men who had physical power and money, regardless of how they got it. And in that restructured field, the body, styled in a very particular way, became one of the most reliable conversion mechanisms that was available to women. This is not some type of weird false consciousness. It's not their stupidity. It was a rational adaptation to a collapsed system without a lot of opportunity. Let's look at Bulgaria and how it transformed from socialism to a thug oligarchy. It's the year 1997. The country has experienced one of the worst hyperinflation crises in the European post-war history. The Bulgarian currency has lost most of its value. The country has been stuck in an economic crisis for years. People are forming queues outside of banks that are failing. The average monthly salary in 97 roughly converted is just a few dollars. The socialist safety nets, for instance, access to employment or subsidized housing or even institutional structures that gave ordinary citizens a first foothold, they're all gone, wiped away. The society that looked stable just a decade earlier appeared to be in complete shambles. Into this vacuum steps a class of men known in Bulgarian as the mutri. This word roughly translates as mugs or faces. These men were often instrumentalized and used by the socialist elite in the transition years as private security or henchmen. By the mid to late 1990s, they had become the de facto economic elite, running protection rackets, privatizing state assets through violence and corruption. They were controlling the nightlife, the construction industry as well, and the nascent private media landscape. Those were first industries that actually made some money. The Mutri have never been subtle. Their wealth is displayed ostentatiously. Mercedes cars, fur coats, gold jewelry, large villas, in an era when most Bulgarians couldn't even afford to pay their electricity bill. Their tastes are maximalist. Picture somebody loud, boastful, and always trying to look expensive. They were completely indifferent to the cultivated restraint of the socialist era, and they had very particular preferences about women, which were directly inspired from the adult entertainment industry. Those men did not value any cultural capital, they didn't value diplomas or professional credentials, because those were legacies of a system that they helped to destroy in the first place. What they did recognize and reward is a different currency entirely. Out of this environment emerges chalga, the Bulgarian pop folk music. That's a particular genre that fuses traditional folk melodies of the Balkans with synthesized beats and Turkish and Roma influences. The lyrics celebrate, without any irony or apology, money, sex, and the male power of the mutri. The chalga music videos aren't subtle either. The women always appear stylized in a very particular way that seems to send a clear message that this body is available to the powerful men. The visual vocabulary is consistent and deliberate. Minimal clothing, heavy makeup, gold jewelry, fur, and poses borrowed directly from the adult industries. The men in the videos or referenced in the lyrics are wealthy. Often the transaction between a singer and a powerful man is depicted in a very explicit way. The figure most crystallizing this logic was Andrea, born Daniela Rangelova, and she is a very known figure in Bulgaria because she's so provocative and she has built a career that spans over 2 decades. During her peak around 2010, she was permanently positioned on the edge of the adult entertainment industry without ever crossing into it. But that's a position that was a successful business strategy, and it depicted what her audience and her patrons really required. The chalga world orbits around a couple of production companies with rumors surrounding the labels that they had ties to the biggest thugs and questionable people. Allegedly, the clubs and the television channels that broadcast the raunchy videos were part of the broader ecosystem that is built on criminal capital and organized around the particular tastes of the men who held power. While the particular aesthetic has become popular in both Western and Eastern Europe, there's quite a notable difference. Above all, the Eastern European development is much less about individual circumstances or choices than it is about symptoms of a collapsed society. This is a society where you cannot rely on converting your skills or merit into anything. In Catherine Hakim's terms, the erotic capital has become the primary and perhaps only reliable form of convertible capital, the chalga aesthetic wasn't niche or subculture in the 1990s or 2000s. It was the dominant culture because everything circled around the taste of the powerful men who held coercive power. To a degree, this might be an Eastern European pathology, as Bulgaria was not alone in this development. In the post-socialist countries, variations of the same dynamic emerged wherever a state collapsed, and it coincided with the rise of criminal or oligarchic power. This is also a period when the stereotype about easy Eastern European women has emerged. In Romania, the parallel genre to chalga is called manele. It's stigmatized by educated Romanians as low class and Roma inflected, but it's enormously popular and it's organized almost around the same visual logic. The female performers are styled as decorative ornaments of male wealth. The lyrics are celebrating the man and all of his money. In Serbia, the genre turbo folk has probably been the most academically studied case. The scholar Ivana Kronia has depicted in her work Deadly Glamour or Smrtonosni sjaj how the genre has emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s during the Milosevic era and the Yugoslav wars, and as well how it fused with the hypersexualized femininity with nationalist sentiment in ways that served the political project of the regime. The most popular singer of the era is XXX, born Svetlana Velichkovic, who married a warlord named Željko Ražnatović. She has been under scrutiny for exactly that questionable connection. How could you marry a warlord? While her husband was killed, XXX remains to be a popular figure in Serbia until today. In Russia and Ukraine, the equivalent culture surrounded the oligarch class that emerged in the 90s and their sputnici, or female companions. They were as well styled in a way that signaled total availability on one hand, on the other hand, total material dependency. Reality television running in Russia in the 2000s normalized this particular arrangement. It presented the capture of a wealthy man as a very legitimate aspirational thing to do for a young woman. What unites all of these different cases is pretty obvious. In each context, a system collapses, and in the vacuum, a group of powerful men appeared out of the ranks of either military, secret services, or the old power affiliations. Those men holding the new power are having seemingly very similar tastes and preferences when it comes to women. Women are following those preferences, following a rational logic of survival. Let me get a little personal here. I've observed the effects of chalga culture as a teenager and as a child. I watched how young women who were intelligent and curious and who started university degrees or a career make a calculation. And a calculation went something like that. The degree leads nowhere and a career is precarious because the institutions that use to reward credentials are unreliable. But a certain kind of man, not necessarily a criminal, but somebody who's adjacent to money and power, offers something more concrete. And to attract that type of man, you need to present yourself in a specific way. You need to signal availability, femininity in a particular register, and an absence of threatening ambition. Suddenly, girls in small towns and big cities started to overdo lip fillers just like their stars, and they competed on breast augmentations while remaining at a dangerously low weight. I saw several women undergoing this very particular and deliberate transformation. Not forced, exactly, but not entirely free. It seems to be a natural response to the signals that the culture was sending loudly since the 1990s. What I saw as a child and teenager was how the habitus was being rewritten in real time in Bulgaria under structural pressure. And the reason this cut so deep for me is because it was such a dramatic departure from what I had learned from the generations of my mother and my grandmother before. The adult women that I knew as a child and teenager were formed by a different set of expectations. Obviously, not perfect, because the socialist system had its own profound flaws and defects. But those women at least understood that there was a place for them in society. Education was encouraged, and they worked, they contributed to society and to their communities. Femininity and professional seriousness were not in a contradiction at all. That understanding was protected as well by the institutions and the culture of that time. However imperfect the state during socialism was, there was a pathway to convert multiple types of capital. When the institutions and the entire system collapsed, so did the understanding that you could convert your merit. The 1990s were a lost decade, and into the 2000s, the conditions for women had gotten worse in multiple ways, even though they had technically more freedom. This is the era where the adult entertainment aesthetic crept in as a survival mechanism. In spite of the dark years Eastern European have faced in the 90s into the 2000s, I do see a silver lining. A woman's position in a society is not static. In fact, it is a lot more flexible than a man's position. Bulgaria today is a completely different country than it was in the year 2000. It's still struggling with corruption and very high levels of distrust in the political system, but it's actually progressing. Over the last decade, GDP growth has picked up, entrepreneurship has promoted a lot of new businesses, and a new middle class is emerging in the larger cities. The desperation of the 1990s is nearly forgotten for the young generation. The Mutri era has not ended, but it has been partially displaced, and you can see that in the culture. The Chalgo genre is still there, but it no longer occupies the same dominant position it held in the 2000s. Young Bulgarian women nowadays have more role models and versions to choose from. There are more perspectives of what it means to be a woman. When the system changes, the rational adaptations change with it. You don't need to persuade women to abandon survival strategies or change in a specific way. If there are better options than taking off your clothing and catering to weird, powerful men, women are gonna do that. What matters are reliable institutions that stabilize society. That means the rule of law has to function, the labor markets have to reward credentials and effort. Those are pathways that allow people to accumulate different types of capital. The explicit sexual aesthetic in the European post-socialist context has never been a cultural problem with a cultural solution. It has always been a structural problem and an economic one that required growth and opportunity. When circumstances improve, women will naturally walk through the doors that are opening for them. With this in mind, I find it highly concerning to observe what is going on with the adult content careers that have been becoming an attractive option to millions of teenagers and young women in the West. Can this ever be a sign of a healthy society? I'm pretty doubtful about that. Again, there's a corporate influence that is using the feminist language of empowerment and liberation. And again, somehow it feels off. But maybe that's just me. What do you think?